While in my previous notes I discussed the relation of the collective unconscious to Jung's concept of typology, in this video I will be discussing a few more points related more directly to the 8 psychological types which Jung proposed. Number 1. Hyper-extroversion manifests as hysteria, while hyper-introversion manifests as psychasthenia. That had better be how it's pronounced. Jung discusses how an overly extroverted or introverted attitude leads to the development of a neurosis, most commonly hysteria in the case of extroversion, and psychasthenia in the case of introversion. These neuroses develop in part because of the function itself going too far, you might say, but is made worse by the protests of the other, now overly repressed functions, primarily that function most opposite in nature to the most dominant function, which von Franz called the inferior function, leading to the idea of the Heraclitean function axes. In any case, the nature of these neuroses help to shed light on their corresponding attitude. Hysteria is the most common neurosis of the extroverted attitude. Of course, the definition of hysteria has been altered to some degree over time, but Jung says that hysteria is marked by an exaggerated rapport with the immediate environment, including an increased suggestibility, as well as an increased desire to affect or impress oneself on the environment. Often, hysteria is associated with dramatic expressions of shallow emotions for the sake of getting attention. In layman's terms, hysteria is Chicken Little freaking out and running around town screaming at the top of his lungs, "The sky is falling, the sky is falling, blah!" Now, by considering hysteria as an exaggeration or oversaturation of extroversion, we can see where extroversion is ultimately heading if unchecked. That is, its ultimate trajectory, which is an exaggerated rapport with the immediate environment. The individual becomes lost in objects, dragging their subject along behind them as they answer the calls and demands of objects and objective data. As a result, they lose any subjective grounding they had and become a raving lunatic. Now, the most common neurosis of the introverted attitude is called psychasthenia. This has not become a common word in our language, but according to Jung, it is marked by an extreme sensitivity and a proneness to exhaustion or fatigue. In other words, the individual's subject becomes like a patch of sensitive skin that stings and aches at every passing breeze or fleeting touch, which obviously eventually produces an exhaustion within the mind. You might think of Edgar Allan Poe's character in The Raven, twitching at the slightest sounds, becoming more and more distressed and worked up as the suspense mounts in the story until he just collapses in a heap on the floor. Psychasthenia is characterized by phobias, obsessions, compulsions, or excessive anxiety. The key here is its extreme sensitivity. This might sound very familiar to hysteria, but while hysteria is characterized by a rapport with the environment and an exaggerated subjugation to it, you could say, psychasthenia is characterized more by an exaggerated subjective reaction to stimuli. The smallest event creates the most disturbing noises as it bangs around against the individual's subjective factor, to use a metaphor from the last video. Soon every object has a powerful effect on the subject, requiring equally powerful reactions in order to subdue them, and leading to compulsive behavior or excessive worry or phobias of certain objects or events. Point number 2, the inferior function manifests as a mockery of its own attitude. Often along with the neuroses of an exaggerated attitude comes a malicious reaction from the now overly repressed inferior function, as though it were trying to take back its rightful territory through underhanded and desperate means. In the case of the extrovert, repressed introversion reacts to the conscious love of objects by suggesting, through the unconscious, an equally exaggerated love of the subject. Thus, the objectivity of the extrovert's process is compromised. The individual's understanding of objects becomes infected with the subject's own repressed personal desires. Soon, the objective process becomes, in actuality, a reflection of the subject's own ideas and biases, just hidden behind this facade. Inferior introverted feeling, for instance, manifests in the ETJ type as an oversensitivity to people questioning their conclusions. They treat their conclusions more like personal values than objective truths and defend them with all due emotionality for that. For instance, the ETJ may be tempted to make ad hominem arguments, that is, attack the personal character of their opponent rather than their actual position. The point is to eliminate the threat as effectively as possible, and this can even lead into a hypocritical willingness to alter facts or falsify evidence in order to preserve the conclusions that the ETJ has identified themselves with. Inferior introverted thinking manifests in the EFJ type as the loss of charm and warmth that is normally in their accommodation. Instead, their accommodation becomes a facade, the result of a cold, calculating, untrusting ulterior motivation, satisfying people's social expectations, but in no way appealing to the heart, only the head. Their displays of emotion become overdone, performed only to produce a certain effect and not out of any true feeling. They become unnervingly shallow, driven only by personal logical goals. Inferior introverted intuition manifests in the ESP type as a tendency for wild suspicions, hunches, or bizarre projections into the future, all extrapolated from the smallest details. Superstitions arise, often of a vaguely magical character, requiring compulsive rites or actions to accommodate them. In other words, the ESP type is vulnerable to mock NI visions, you could say, or mock intuitions, a hunch of something incredibly grand and holistic and overarching, but requiring compulsive action. Inferior introverted sensation manifests in the ENP type, rather similarly to inferior introverted intuition in the ESP type. The major difference is that instead of magical grand NI visions, the ENP becomes anxiously tied to the impressions arising directly from objects. The image Jung prefers here is that of a hypochondriac, who is focusing so much on the objective possibilities over, under, and around the object itself that they easily fall prey to unconscious fears regarding sensations directly from the object, which often take the form of a hypochondriac's unrelenting anxieties, whether about the body or about other things. Now, in the case of the introvert, repressed extroversion reacts to the conscious focus on the subjective factor by unconsciously suggesting an exaggerated importance for the objective factor. Thus, the object suddenly becomes terrifying, something that must be dealt with at once and with sufficient force. Inferior extroverted feeling, for instance, manifests in the ITP types as an unusual touchiness surrounding their personal ideas. The ITP feels with exaggerated force outside sentiments impinging on them. The more they become introverted, the harder it becomes to relate their ideas to current objective material, and so the more frightening and frustrating objective sentiments become for them, which in turn encourages the ITP to lash out emotionally, even viciously, in self-defense of their ideas, which serves, of course, to further isolate them. And this cycle continues until ultimately the ITP becomes a lonely hermit who hates everybody's guts because he is incapable or she is incapable of expressing their ideas to everybody else. Inferior extroverted thinking manifests in IFP types as passive aggression. That's how I like to put it, but more specifically, it's an extremely subdued expression of feelings that underhandedly coerces and controls others. There's this unhealthy, unconscious, and very fearful need to dominate the environment, as the IFP considers other people are thinking about them. Must, of course, be nasty, evil rumors or conspiracies against them. The IFP thus attempts to counterplot just as craftily, and thus retake their environment. Inferior extroverted intuition manifests in ISJ types as primarily a fear of the future or future possibilities. These become their terror. The ISJ type suddenly discerns, although darkly, all of the sordid, unpleasant possibilities which the future may hold. Thus they become over-conscientious, over-skeptical of things, and over-preparatory, sniffing out the smallest signs of possible evil in something and fighting against it with a dozen or so strategies, just in case. Inferior extroverted sensation manifests in INJ types as a hypersensitivity of the sense organs, resulting in either hypochondriac symptoms or more often intemperance and a peculiar strength of the sensual instincts. In other words, There is an excessive reliance on or reaction to the sensory effect of objects. They hold exaggerated importance in the INJ's unconscious and can thus exercise undue sway on their actions in the form of compulsions or obsessions. Point number 3, which I wanted to make, is just some basic Jungian-based descriptions of the 8 types. And this is an alternate way to look at the functions and their dominant type based more directly off of Jung's descriptions. By that I mean descriptions of the types that make more use of Jung's own imagery rather than just the theory behind it. For example, Jung describes the extroverted thinking dominant type, or ETJ, as someone who develops a rational, empirical-based formula by which to judge the world. All is right which corresponds with the formula, and all is wrong that contradicts it. It's very straightforward. The formula is imposed in its fullest weight on the ETJ themselves, but also on those around the ETJ, in proportion of their intimacy with them. The ETJ type would then often have a definite morality or a moralist air about them, in that they know strictly what is right and wrong and will defend their formula just as strictly. Jung describes FE dominants, or EFJs, as people who are well attuned to the general feeling atmosphere of a situation and the best way to improve it, maintain it, or to simply navigate it. They know what is generally considered to be appropriate, cordial, or comforting. They are famously willing to make compliments or say things purely out of concern for another person rather than out of their own depth of feeling. In other words, they are sincerely insincere. Or probably a better way to put that is supremely accommodating, because all of their feeling is directed outwards towards other people or things. Jung describes the SE dominant, or ESP, as an individual driven to reach the highest pitch of actuality or reality in their life experience. Jung emphasizes how this type is not technically rational, because to them what is good is simply what produces the best sensations. They are not naturally concerned with right or wrong as we normally think of it, assuming that we're a rational type, of course, but rather delicious or distasteful, interesting or boring. They are, at their best, a very refined aesthete and usually a jolly, engaging character. Jung describes the NE dominant, or ENP, as an individual somewhat similar to the ESP in their irrationality, that is, that what is good to them is what produces the best perceptions. Only in the ENP's case, it is not the highest pitch of actuality that they seek, but the greatest amount of possibilities or possible actualities. Jung gives an interesting metaphor that these types feel that every situation in life is like a locked room that they have to figure out how to escape. To the ENP, it's only a matter of time, it seems, before things become boring, and they need to find some way to make it interesting. Once this is accomplished, of course, it's only a matter of time again before things become boring. The reason for this is because the focus is on the possibilities of something, so as soon as it becomes an actual thing, the interest is lost. Thus, Jung emphasizes how these types tend to sow a great deal, but have trouble staying around long enough to reap the benefits. They are supremely enterprising and uncannily prospective. Jung describes the TI type, or ITP, as a curious reversal of the ETJ, for while they may appear very similar at first in that they develop and hold to the intellectual logical conclusions that they develop, the ITP actually retreats from objective data and is therefore not truly empirical in the sense we think of it. Their true focus, whether they realize it or not, is not to draw conclusions from objective data, but to reconcile subjective ideas with objective data. The focus is on a logical idea that originates in the collective or possibly personal unconscious. The ITP is trying to flesh out this idea, figure it out, discover all its parts and implications, and try to discover it as purely as possible in the current objective situation. Now, Jung describes the FI type, or IFP, as someone seeking after an inner intensity. He says that the saying, "still waters run deep," applies very well to IFPs, because their feeling is not directed outwards, but inwards, meaning there is often a certain degree of coldness or dispassion, ultimately a devaluation of the actual object in favor of the subjective impression or subjective idea aroused by the object in the subject. The IFP, in some sense, wants to love for love's sake. The key here is the seeking after an inner intensity. Rather like the ITP seeks to flesh out their logical ideas, the IFP seeks to flesh out and experience more fully their valuations or inner feelings. Jung describes the SI type, or ISJ, as a curious type because, like the ESP, they are in a sense seeking the highest pitch of actuality or experience, but it's the highest pitch of subjective actuality. The idea here is that the object only serves as a stimulus for subjective sensations from the collective or the personal unconscious. The ISJ thus does not experience the object's sensations, but their own subjective sensations aroused by the object. The effect is that the ISJ experiences as sort of psychic mirror world, which doesn't just reflect the subject's personal interpretations, but much more often, if not entirely, is reflecting the collective unconscious's interpretations of things. Every objective stimulus is translated by the collective unconscious's interpretation, and that is what the ISJ experiences. Jung actually says that the ISJ is viewing the background psychic processes of reality. Finally, Jung describes the NI type, or INJ, with words that someone new to typology would very likely find unflattering. And the same goes for the other types, but it seems especially so here. But the concept, I think, is still very accurate. He says that the INJ, like the ISJ, views the collective unconscious's interpretation of reality, and thus views essentially a psychic mirror world. But the difference is that instead of viewing the psychic mirror of reality itself, the INJ views the psychic mirror of possible reality. Specifically, he says that while the ISJ focuses on the actual sensations aroused by an object, the INJ focuses on what it perceives to be the psychic instigation for that sensation. In other words, INJs don't focus on the object itself, nor do they focus on the subjective impression itself, but they focus on that part of the subjective factor which mediated the subjective impression. To use a previous metaphor, the INJ is interested in the way that the subjective factor vibrates when it is struck, but doesn't hear the actual sound or truly see what object hit it. Thus, the INJ perceives the actual material of the collective unconscious, and is supremely interested, therefore, in the possibilities of its reactions and motions. The INJ then gives up much of any contact with reality for a look at the possibilities of the background psychic processes of reality. As a result of this, the INJ becomes something of a psychological prophet, if you want to put it that way, who perceives or feels certain grand motions occurring behind events that are leading up to something. I hope this video was useful to you and interesting for you, and thank you again very much for your support. I will be heading to college soon, so I cannot promise that I will be able to make a video next week. Hopefully I will, but I will be in the midst of traveling, so just letting you know that there will be some changes in my environment and stuff, so I'm not quite sure when I'll be able to get back to you guys, but when I do, I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much.